Hey everybody, welcome to Unit 13. I've entitled this unit The Gathering Storm, the Terrible 1850s. What we're going to do in this lecture is look at the 1850s, this terrible, horrible decade in American history. And this really was a decade from hell. When we started this decade, things were great. Everyone was happy. And that was because of the Compromise of 1850. But by the end of this decade, we are going to be killing each other in record numbers. By the end of this decade, we will be at war with one another. So, what in the holy hell happened? Well, guys, what happened was a series of events throughout the 1850s that are going to alienate North and South from one another to the point that the sectional differences between them will finally rupture and create an American Civil War. And the way we're going to approach this unit is by breaking it down into 3 parts. Each of these parts, we're going to kind of look at some specific events that occurred in the 1850s. Now, we're going to move chronological here, and some of these events are more important than others, but all of them help explain how we went from compromise in 1850 to the American Civil War. And so in part 1, we're going to discuss things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, very important novel in American history, something known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then Bleeding Kansas. And then we'll get into some other events in part 2 and in part 3. But this is part 1 of the terrible 1850s. And kind of the first significant event of the 1850s that begins to alienate North and South from each other is the publication of a novel in 1852, a novel known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, a little bit about this book. This book was written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. There's a picture of her on the screen there. She was the daughter and a sister of a prominent abolitionist in Massachusetts. She was very deep into the abolitionist movement, and she believed that she needed to add to this movement by writing a book. Now, I want to be completely honest here about Harriet Beecher Stowe. Everything she knew about slavery, she had learned from abolitionists. She never once stepped foot in the South, and she never once met a slave. And I just think it's fair to get that on the table because this may have prevented her from getting the full picture of slavery. Nevertheless, she wrote this novel of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was published in 1852. The book itself was extremely popular in the North. Very, very popular book. Virtually everyone had either read this book, or if they hadn't read it, they knew the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin because there were plays that were adapted out of the book. People were talking about the book. And if actually you take all the sales that it generated in 1852 and apply it for today, it would today be a New York Times bestseller. And again, if people hadn't read it, they knew about it and they knew the story. Now, the book is the story really of a man named Uncle Tom, a slave, but also it's the story of a slave woman named Eliza. And readers of Uncle Tom's Cabin would have read the stories of Eliza, a woman that, in order to prevent her son from being sold away to another slave owner, decides to run away to her freedom in the North. And of course, she is going to be relentlessly pursued on her travels, trying to make it to first the North and then to Canada. She's relentlessly pursued. She deals with enormous hardship, but through it all, the character of Eliza has a very warm and gentle heart. Then they also would have read the story of Uncle Tom himself, who was sold to a very mean-spirited slave owner by the name of Simon Legree, who repeatedly would whip and abuse Tom for trying to teach other slaves how to read. Now, in the end, Uncle Tom was killed by Simon Legree for trying to impart religion to Simon Legree's other slaves. And so these were the things, these were the images that the readers of Uncle Tom's Cabin would have had planted in their minds. And what happens here as a result of all of this is that an entire generation of Northerners who had read this book or knew of the story are now sensitized to the condition of slaves and just to slavery in general. this book really opens the eyes of an entire generation of Northerners to the evils of slavery. They now recognize for the first time, really, what it was like to be a slave and how horribly awful it was for your average slave in the South. And so the book's effect on the North was that it kind of galvanized an entire generation into the opinion that slavery was wrong. It was so wrong and horrible. And the way this worked is that whenever a Northerner now heard the word slave or slavery, the images that pop into their mind are the images of Eliza and the images of Uncle Tom. So the book was extremely popular in the North, but in the South, Southerners reacted very differently to this book. Southerners reacted to the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by referring to it as revolutionary propaganda. They believed that this book was likely to stir up slave rebellions, such as the image you see here on the screen. And their argument here was that, if slaves get a hold of this book and they now understand that there's a place in this country where they can be free, that they might respond by either killing their masters or running away in mass numbers. And so Southerners reacted very negatively to the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, referring to it as revolutionary propaganda. And many Southerners actually wrote novels in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin in an attempt to kind of counter the perception of slavery that a Northerner would have got in Uncle Tom's Cabin. All of these publications, there's a few of the more famous Southern novels written to counter Uncle Tom's Cabin. Things like Uncle Robin in His Cabin in Virginia and Uncle Tom Without One in Boston. It's one hell of a title. But other books such as The Planter's Northern Bride, The Sword and the Distaff, and even a children's book, Little Eva, The Flower of the South. And what you would have seen in a lot of these Southern responses to Uncle Tom's Cabin was the argument that, the North was only a place in which people were slaves to wages. That wage labor in the North, workers working for a salary, were actually were worse off than slaves. They would make the case that business owners in the North didn't care about their workers, but on the flip side, these Southerners would argue and claim that they cared more for their slaves. And in the South, it became very dangerous to be caught with a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you were a white in the South and got caught with this, you would have been called an abolitionist. You probably would have been beaten up, at the very least threatened with physical violence. And if you were a slave and you got caught with a copy of this book, you most likely would have been hanged. So this was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The reason it was significant is because it divided North and South. It kind of drove a wedge between them. And the way that worked is that now you have Northerners, an entire generation of them, sensitized to the evils of slavery. And that's a result of this book. On the flip side, you see Southerners reacting very negatively to this and almost feeling like it's an affront to them. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of this first important event of the 1850s that we can look at in terms of driving the wedge deeper and deeper between North and South, creating the opportunity, creating the environment in which a civil war is possible. So that was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The next event is a very significant event. It's the biggest of these first three in part one. It is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So that's where we're going to turn to next. Okay, guys, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this. We're going to kind of break it down into nuggets here. We're going to talk about the background to this act. Then talk about the Kansas-Nebraska bill that led to this act. Then we're going to talk about the Northern reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then ultimately what's significant about this. But let's start with the background here. Guys, to understand how the Kansas-Nebraska Act came into existence, we need to have a brief discussion about transcontinental railroads. Specifically, transcontinental railroads linking the eastern half of the United States to California. Now look, Americans in the 1850s began for the first time in our nation's history. They began discussing the need and the idea of building a transcontinental railroad to California. This discussion began in the United States because in 1849 gold was discovered in California, and the only way for the vast majority of Americans to get there was to either take a very long, very hard trip by wagon across the continent, or as you can see by this flyer here, take a steamship all the way to South America, sometimes all the way around the tip of South America. So what happened here in the 1850s is that a lot of Americans began talking about the need for an easy way to get to California, because it was believed all you had to do was get out here and you were going to get rich. The rumors were that all you had to do was show up and you just picked the gold up off the ground. That obviously didn't happen. But you need to understand that in the early 1850s, Americans are talking about the need for a transcontinental railroad. Okay, the problem here is that if we're going to build a transcontinental railroad, the problem here, and an issue that was dividing North and South, is where would that railroad originate from? Would the railroad come out of the southern states, or would it come out of the northern states? And this was a dispute. Southerners wanted the railroad to come out of the south so that they would have easy access to California, but northerners wanted it to come out of the north because they wanted the easy access to California. And that's where, entering into the story, comes a man by the name of Stephen A. Douglas. Okay? So, Stephen A. Douglas. Let me show you a picture of him and talk a little bit about him. Here he is. Stephen A. Douglas, in the 1850s, was a U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois. Now, he was, by the 1850s, the most famous national politician in the country. Everybody thought this guy was going to be president one day, including himself. He wants to build a transcontinental railroad that will leave his home state of Illinois and travel across the continent to California. And the reason he wants this is that he wants to be known as the man that opened up the West. And he believes that this will be a very powerful image, a very powerful concept that he will be able to use to propel himself to the White House one day. So, in the 1850s, Douglas begins making the case that a transcontinental railroad should leave from Illinois headed towards California. But Douglas has a problem here. In order to get a railroad built across the continent, the railroad is going to have to cross through the unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase. Let me show you a map of what I'm talking about here. This is a map from 1853, right before we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in 1853, Douglas proposed what was known as the Nebraska Bill. And what the Nebraska Bill was going to do was take that area right there in the middle of the country where it says unorganized territory. The Nebraska Bill was going to create an organized territory out of that big mass of land. Now, what Douglas is doing here is that if this becomes an organized territory, it means that the federal government will now provide security for this territory. And if the territory can become secure from Native Americans, then this will foster and encourage migration to these areas. And as more migration comes into this unorganized territory, you'll get the rise of cities and towns and villages. And then you'll be able to easily construct a transcontinental rail line through the unorganized territory. So the purpose of the Nebraska Bill was to move this unorganized territory to an organized territory, thereby providing security for it. This would encourage migration, and with more Americans living here, it would be easier to build a transcontinental railroad. So that's what the Nebraska Bill was all about. Now, when the Nebraska Bill was proposed on the floor of the Congress, immediately there began a debate between Northerners and Southerners over this Nebraska Bill. Southerners told Douglas that they would support his bill, but that they had some conditions, and that if Douglas was willing to meet these conditions, they would support his bill. So let's talk about these Southern conditions. Southerners in the Whig and in the Democratic Party made conditions on Douglas in order for them to support his Nebraska Bill. And here were their conditions. They wanted to see that this unorganized territory would be divided into two territories. And I'll explain why here in a second. They also demanded that this bill repeal the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, which had been in place since 1820. Now, just to review, that line stated that slavery is prohibited north of that line within the Louisiana Territory. So what Southerners are arguing for Douglas here is that if he will put into this bill a repeal of the Missouri Compromise line, they'll support him. And the last condition, the last demand they place on Douglas in order to give him their support, is that they want to see that that these two new territories that are created, that popular sovereignty be applied to these territories. Now, just to review, popular sovereignty is the idea that the settlers of these territories will decide for themselves whether or not slavery goes there. So these demands are steep. These are dangerous demands, as we'll see here in a second. But these were the demands that Southerners placed upon Douglas in order to support his Nebraska bill. If Douglas wants this bill passed, he needs Southern support, as well as the support of Northern Democrats. Now, what you see on the screen here are the two political parties, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. But within these parties, you had kind of a northern and a southern wing of each party. Now, Douglas was a Democrat, and he was from Illinois, so he's a Northern Democrat. So Northern Democrats, they look upon Douglas as kind of the leader of their wing of the party. So they will support him in his Nebraska bill. But if Douglas wants this bill to pass, he's going to need two of the other three remaining wings. And Southerners, Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats have already told him they will support his bill if he gives in to these demands. And that's exactly what Douglas did. Douglas will cave completely to the demands of the Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats, and he already has Northern Democrats on board, so he has three of the necessary four wings to get this thing passed. And what it was ultimately passed as was no longer the Nebraska bill. It was now passed as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854. So let's talk real quick about what the Kansas-Nebraska Bill did. It's the same thing as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 did was exactly what Southerners wanted. It took the rest of that Louisiana territory and divided it into two territories. The Kansas Territory there in the middle, and the Nebraska Territory to the north. Now, why Southerners wanted two territories was, well, you can look at this map and look where the Kansas Territory is compared to the state of Missouri. What Southerners were thinking is that if they can divide this territory, making it easier to form a state, that they can use Missouri as a launching pad to send people into the Kansas Territory, so that when that territory votes to allow slavery or not, they'll have more people there. Now, more on that in a second. So the first thing the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it divides the Louisiana Territory into two, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. The second thing that it did is that it did in fact repeal the 3630 Missouri Compromise line. That is no longer applied. And then the last thing it did is it applied popular sovereignty to both of these territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is what Douglas ultimately had passed through Congress, hoping that it would make him extremely popular and he'd be president one day. But the whole thing, as we will see later in this unit, is going to blow up in his face. So this is how the Kansas-Nebraska Act came into being. This is what it did. Let's talk about the Northern reaction to all of this. Northerners, generally speaking, were extremely angry over the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the biggest reason they were is that Northerners had always looked at that 3630 Missouri Compromise line as kind of a steel door that kept slavery pinned up. They had always thought that the Louisiana Territory north of that line was always reserved for them, not for slave interest. They feared that allowing slavery to expand into these areas would allow rich slaveholders to take their land, that it would allow Southerners to continue to have more of a control and say over the government because of that three-fifths compromise. But they also feared that they would never be able to compete with jobs in these areas because they would be competing with slaves. And whenever wage labor is competing with slave labor, there is no competition. Everyone will always go with slave labor. But added into this, Northerners were also upset because you do need to understand that Northerners were just as racist as Southerners. Northerners simply did not want to live around blacks. And so for a whole bunch of reasons, these Northerners, generally speaking, were extremely upset over the repeal of the 3630 Compromise Line, which was part of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now keep this in mind as we get to the significance. And speaking of that, what then is significant about the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, a few things. Number one, once again, the act has raised the question of slavery's expansion into the territories of the United States, and it has raised the question of whether or not Congress has the power to restrict it. And of course, as we've seen already, this is the question that will lead to the American Civil War. We thought we solved it in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. We thought we settled it again in 1850 with the Compromise of 1850, but here it is again. It just won't go away. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is significant because it raises the question of slavery's expansion into the territories. And of course, that's the question that will lead to the American Civil War. But the other reason it's significant is that vast amounts of the northern population are now so angry over the passage of this act that the Whig Party is utterly destroyed on the national level. The northern Whigs abandon the party, and they create a third party. A party that stood 100% opposed to the expansion of slavery. That party that was formed as a result and in opposition of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the Republican Party. This is the birth of the modern-day Republican Party. This is where it came from. Okay? Now, this is significant in its own right because this party made it be known that what they stood for was 100% opposition to the expansion of slavery. And when they arrived on the scene in the aftermath of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Southerners knew exactly what this party stood for. And Southerners were already beginning to make the argument that should this party ever come to take control of the government, that Southerners would likely leave the Union. Now in 1854, nobody thinks the Republicans are going to do this. But you can already see Southerners looking at this party on edge. They're a little nervous about what this party stands for. Okay, so the second reason the Kansas-Nebraska Act was significant is that it leads to the destruction of the Whig Party, and it leads to the rise of the Republican Party, because the northern population abandons the Whig Party and creates the purely sectional, purely northern party of the Republicans. And the last reason we care about the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that it is going to lead to a period of great unrest and great bloodshed within the Kansas territory. And this period is known as Bleeding Kansas, which is the last event we're going to talk about here in part one. So, Bleeding Kansas. We'll do like we always do. We'll talk about the background of how Bleeding Kansas came about. And we'll talk about how the eruption of violence actually took place. And then ultimately, what was significant about Bleeding Kansas. Alright, the background. Following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, radicals in both the North and the South began moving very quickly to try to populate the Kansas territory with either pro-slavery settlers or anti-slavery settlers, so that when that territory voted on whether or not to allow slavery, it was hoped on both sides they would have more people there, and the territory would either be closed to slavery or would be open to slavery. And the guy on the screen here, he kind of represents one of these southern radicals that are moving quickly to populate the Kansas territory. This is David Atchison. He was a U.S. Senator from Missouri, the state right next to the Kansas territory. And you can see some of his quotes here. Atchison proclaimed that Northerners that were moving to the Kansas territory were, his words by the way, Negro thieves and abolitionist tyrants. And he began encouraging Missourians to move to the Kansas territory to defend the institution of slavery with, quote, the bayonet and with blood. and if necessary, quote, to kill every goddamn abolitionist in the territory. It's guys like David Atchison and the people he encouraged to move to Kansas that are going to turn Kansas into a nightmare. But he represents kind of the southern radicals that are creating the situation in Kansas. The same thing can be applied to the northern radicals. This is Henry Ward Beecher. Now, this man was a Presbyterian minister in Boston, Massachusetts. And Beecher raised funds to send rifles to abolitionist settlers in the Kansas Territory, stating that these weapons were a greater moral agent in dealing with a slaveholder than 100 Bibles. And the press subsequently nicknamed these 50 caliber rifles that he was sending to Kansas as Beecher's Bibles. Now, the reason I tell you about these two guys is that they represent others in the North and South that are beginning to lose perspective. Okay, these types of guys like Beecher and Atchison, their rhetoric is very violent. It's very dangerous. And so what's happening here is that both individuals like Beecher and Atchison and others like them are encouraging people to move to the Kansas Territory, not to have a new life, not to make something of themselves, but simply to be there for political reasons, to be there when the vote on slavery is held. And it's these people that move to the Kansas Territory purely for political reasons. These are the people that turn Kansas into a nightmare. So let's talk real quick about how the violence erupted. The violence in the Kansas Territory began because of a man named John Brown. Here he is. A little bit about John Brown. We're going to see him later on in 1859. John Brown was a die-hard abolitionist. He was a firm believer that slavery was morally wrong, unchristian, and that unless it was gotten rid of in the United States, that God was going to bathe this country in blood. He believed so strongly that slavery was morally wrong that he was willing to kill people that defended slavery, believing that this was sanctified in the eyes of God. Now, is his heart in the right place? Yes, absolutely. In terms of the moral high ground concerning slavery, this guy occupies it. But the means he is going to employ are simply out of control. How did he start it all? You can see on this map, in May of 1856, at a place known as Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown and about 30 of his followers, all of them abolitionists, attacked and massacred pro-slavery settlers coming in from Missouri. These settlers were hacked to pieces and their body parts strewn across the road leading into Kansas as a warning to any other pro-slavery settlers as to what would happen to them. Well, these attacks by abolitionists were followed very quickly by attacks by pro-slavery forces. And you can see a few of them on the map here. This is how the violence erupted in the Kansas Territory, and things quickly spiraled out of control. The capital of the Kansas Territory was attacked by pro-slavery forces. Other cities that were dominated by pro-slavery settlers were attacked by abolitionist forces, and Kansas spiraled into what is known as Bleeding Kansas. Why is it significant? A few reasons, and then we'll finish up here. Bleeding Kansas was significant because it clearly exposed the failure of popular sovereignty. This is the negative outcome of allowing settlers of a territory to decide for themselves an issue such as slavery. So it showed everyone in the country that popular sovereignty is a failed idea. And rather than popular sovereignty isolating the question of slavery's expansion in the territories, it had the opposite effect. And Bleeding Kansas put the issue of slavery's expansion back on the national level. So it had the opposite effect. And when slavery is being debated on the national level, things get out of hand. So we can say then that Bleeding Kansas was significant because it greatly heightened the tensions between both the North and the South. Okay, so we covered Uncle Tom's Cabin, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Bleeding Kansas. And this will conclude part 1 of Unit 13. In part 2, we're going to explore more of the events of the 1850s that ultimately brought about the American Civil War.